preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. I'm Deborah Seymour, Associate Director of the Charles Simon Center for Adult Life and Learning at the 92nd Street Y. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's presentation, The Blank Slate. I'm particularly happy to welcome you to tonight's lecture, the Newman Lecture, endowed by Nicky Newman Taylor and Harold Tanner in memory of their father, Albert Hardy Newman. The Newman Lecture covers subjects that would have interested Mr. Newman, who held interests in education, psychology, and neuroscience. We thank the Newman Tanner family for their continued support of the 92nd Street Y. Our guest this evening is truly accomplished in the fields of cognitive psychology and linguistics. Pulitzer Prize finalist Steven Pinker is widely acknowledged as one of the world's leading experts on language and the mind. Most well known for his seminal book, The Language Instinct, his newest book, The Blank Slate, re-examines the concept of human nature and its implications. Dr. Pinker is Peter de Flores Professor of Psychology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His research on visual cognition and the psychology of language has earned prizes from the National Academy of Sciences and the American Psychological Association. A well-known writer in both popular and academic fora, Dr. Pinker is editor of Cognition and has written for the New York Times, The New Yorker, Time, and the New Republic. Tonight's format will be as follows. Dr. Pinker will make his presentation and then speak for approximately 45 minutes to an hour, followed by 20 minutes of questions and answers from the audience. A book signing follows the lecture in the lobby immediately adjacent to this auditorium. And now, please join me in welcoming our very special guest, Dr. Steven Pinker.
Thank you very much. It's always a great pleasure to speak at this very special institution. Thank you all for coming. Everyone has a theory of human nature. Everyone has to anticipate the behavior of others, and that means we all need notions, explicit or implicit, about what makes people tick. So much depends on our theory of human nature. We use it to manage our relationships, to bring up our children, to control our own behavior. Our assumptions about learning in our theory of human nature drive our policies in education. Our assumptions about motivation drive our policies in government and law. And because our conception of human nature delineates what we can achieve easily, what we can achieve only with effort or sacrifice, and what we cannot achieve at all, it affects our values, what we think we can reasonably strive for as individuals and as a society. It's no surprise then that theories of human nature have traditionally been associated with religious conceptions, and indeed the Judeo-Christian tradition, as it's evolved over the centuries, has commitments about how the mind works that are in some ways similar to theories in psychology and biology. For example, in the traditional Judeo-Christian theory, the mind is divided into a number of faculties, such as a capacity for love, a moral sense that presents us with standards of right and wrong, and an ability to make choices, which is not compelled by any prior cause. It's an example of free will, although it has an innate tendency to choose sin. There's a theory of how perception works. Namely, we are connected to the world because our mental faculties were designed by God, and God does not deceive us. And there's a theory of mental health, namely that psychological health consists of accepting God's purpose, loving God, and loving our fellow human beings for God's sake. Now, the Judeo-Christian theory depends on certain events narrated in the Bible. For example, the doctrine of free will comes from the book of Genesis, from the idea that Adam and Eve were punished for eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge, which implies that they could have chosen otherwise. Nowadays, no scientifically literate person can believe that the events narrated in the book of Genesis literally took place. And that means that the theory of human nature based on those events obviously had to change. And the main thesis of my book, The Blank Slate, is that we have a new tacit theory of human nature in modern intellectual life that's based on three doctrines, each of which is associated with a dead white male. Now, the first is the blank slate itself, a rough translation of the Latin tabula rasa, which is often associated with this man, John Locke, although an internet search of his complete writing shows that he actually never used the term, but he did use a similar metaphor. And here's what the man did write. Let us suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? Whence comes it by that vast store which the busy and boundless fancy of man has painted on it with an almost endless variety? Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? To this I answer in one word, from experience. Now, the blank slate, then and now, has a great deal of moral appeal. It implied in Locke's time that dogmas, such as the divine right of kings, were not self-evident truths that were implanted in every brain, but rather had to be justified by experiences that different people shared. It undermined a hereditary royalty and aristocracy who could claim no superior wisdom or virtue if their minds started out as blank as everyone else's. And by the same token, it undermines the institution of slavery because slaves could no longer be held to be innately inferior or subservient. These ideas are captured in a New Yorker cartoon that I clipped out about 8 years ago, in which one king says to the other, I don't know anything about the bell curve, but I say heredity is everything. We continue to see an influence of the blank slate in modern intellectual life. Through most of the 20th century, psychology tried to explain all thought, emotion, and behavior with a few simple mechanisms of association and conditioning. The social sciences tried to explain all aspects of human experience in terms of socialization and the influence of the surrounding culture. Here's a typical quotation from a famous anthropologist who wrote, with the exception of the instinctoid reactions in infants to sudden withdrawals of support and to sudden loud noises, the human being is entirely instinctless. Man is man because he has no instincts, because everything he is and has become he has learned, acquired from his culture, from the man-made part of the environment, from other human beings. And that is from the influential public intellectual and anthropologist Ashley Montagu. And here's another example of how widespread the influence of the blank slate is. I think of a child's mind as a blank book. During the first years of his life, much will be written on the pages. The quality of that writing will affect his life profoundly. And that is a quote from Walt Disney. Now, there's a second doctrine that often accompanies the blank slate that was first given its name from John Dryden's The Conquest of Grenada, in which he wrote, I am as free as nature first made man, ere the base laws of servitude began, when wild in woods the noble savage ran. Now, the noble savage, unfortunately, is not attributed to Dryden correctly, but more often is credited with this man, the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But again, he did espouse the idea itself, as we see in this quotation. So many authors, Rousseau said, have hastily concluded that man is naturally cruel and requires a regular system of police to be reclaimed, whereas nothing can be more gentle than him in his primitive state. The more we reflect on this state, the more convinced we shall be that it was the best for man and that nothing could have drawn him out of it but some fatal accident which should never have happened. The example of the savages seems to confirm that mankind was formed ever to remain in this condition, that it is the real youth of the world, and that all ulterior improvements have been so many steps in appearance towards the perfection of individuals, but in fact towards the decrepitness of the species. Now, Rousseau was arguing against someone. He had a foil. He refers to so many authors. And the main one that he had in mind was this man, who wrote, "Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war, and such a war is of every man against every man. In such condition there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, no commodious building, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." This, of course, is the famous quote from Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. Now, Rousseau's alternative to Hobbes, the doctrine of the noble savages, also has a great deal of moral appeal. It implies that there's no need for a domineering Leviathan, a government and police force, to keep us from each other's throats. If we're nasty, then we've got to live with conflict as a permanent part of the human condition. Whereas if deep down we're noble, we can work for a utopian society of the future. Now, children are born savages. So if the savage in us is nasty, that means that bringing up children is a matter of discipline and conflict. Whereas if the savage in us is noble, then bringing up children consists of providing them with opportunities to develop their potential. Like the blank slate, the noble savage has had a remarkably widespread influence in modern intellectual life. We see it in the respect for all things natural and organic and green, and a distrust of anything man-made. Natural medicines, natural childbirth, natural foods, and so on. We see it in the unfashionability of authoritarian styles of child-rearing. We see it as an understanding of our social problems as repairable defects in our institutions, rather than an older view in which they would be seen as part of the inherent tragedy of the human condition. And there's a third doctrine that goes along with these two, generally associated with this man, not completely fairly, René Descartes. And here's what Descartes wrote. "When I consider my mind, I cannot distinguish any parts, but apprehend it to be clearly one and entire. The faculties of willing, feeling, conceiving, etc. cannot be said to be its parts, for it is one and the same mind which employs itself in willing and in feeling and in understanding. But it is quite otherwise with corporeal objects, for there is not one of them imaginable by me, which my mind cannot easily divide into parts. This is sufficient to teach me that the mind or soul of man is entirely different from the body," a doctrine which much later was derided as the doctrine of the ghost in the machine from the philosopher Gilbert Ryle. The ghost in the machine is also an appealing doctrine. We know that machines are insensate, built to be used and disposable, whereas humans are sentient, possessing of dignity and rights, and precious. Machines have some workaday purpose, like grinding corn or sharpening pencils. Humans, we like to think, have a higher purpose: love, worship, good works, knowledge, and beauty. Machines follow the laws of physics, whereas behavior is freely chosen. With choice comes optimism about possibilities for the future, and with it also comes responsibility and the ability to hold people accountable for their actions. Finally, if the mind is completely separate from the body, then that holds out the hope that it can survive the death of the body, an idea whose appeal, I think, is all too obvious. The ghost in the machine also has had a wide impact. We see it when freedom, dignity, and responsibility are seen as incompatible with a biological view of the mind, which is often condemned as reductionist and determinist. No one knows exactly what these words mean, but everyone agrees that they're bad. We see it in the stem cell debate, where some of the theologians who advised George Bush on his policy a bit more than a year ago couched it in terms of ensoulment. That is, when does the fertilized egg get united with the soul, which means that perhaps the most promising medical technology of the 21st century is judged in part in terms of when the ghost first enters the machine. And we see it in everyday thinking and speech. For example, when we talk about John's brain, which presupposes that there's some entity, John, that's separate from the brain that it owns. And when journalists speculate about brain transplants, whereas in fact they should really call them body transplants, because as the philosopher Dan Dennett noted, this is the one transplant operation where it's better to be the donor than the recipient. Now, in the rest of the talk, I'm going to argue that in fact there are many problems with these doctrines. And the most fundamental one is that blank slates don't do anything. People do. A blank slate would just sit there passively receiving inscriptions unless it had some inherent organization or abilities that allowed it to think and reason and act. No one denies the central importance of learning, socialization, and culture in all aspects of human life. The question is, how do they work? What are the innate mechanisms that allow us to learn to begin with? And I think this idea is captured in a dialogue where, in response to Locke's quote that there is nothing in the intellect that was not first in the senses, Leibniz replied, except for the intellect itself. And indeed, many of the modern sciences of mind and brain have threatened the doctrine of the blank slate. Cognitive science, my own field, has underscored that you can't explain how learning takes place unless you posit certain innate mechanisms that accomplish the learning. Among them are some notion of an object and of cause and effect, a number sense, a variety of spatial representations that allow people to keep track of objects and the environment, a theory of mind or an intuitive psychology by which we psych each other out and try to figure out what other people are thinking, a language instinct that allows us to communicate our ideas, and executive systems of the frontal lobes that integrate information from the rest of the brain and that reason and make decisions. Evolutionary psychology has also challenged the blank slate by showing that beneath all of the variation from culture to culture that anthropologists have long reminded us of, there's also a bedrock of human universals, traits that humans in all cultures have in common. And here's a recent survey by the anthropologist Donald Brown of some 300 universals, and they range from aesthetics, affection, ambivalence, and antonyms all the way down to vowel contrasts, weapons, weaning, attempts to control the weather, and the color white. Evolutionary psychology has undermined the blank slate in another way by showing that many human drives are not just ways in which we increase our happiness and well-being as we make decisions throughout the day, but rather are adapted to an ancestral environment, the one in which we evolved, and to Darwinian goals, not necessarily the ones that make us happy. An example is our taste for sugar, salt, and fat, which sends many people to an early grave with, from hypertension, obesity, and so on, but which clearly can be understood as adaptations to an environment in which these nutrient-packed substances were in short supply. Now that we can crank them out in mass quantities, our tastes have not kept up, and we eat too much of them for our own health. A thirst for revenge and a desire to defend one's honor by violence if necessary is a widespread and leads to much misery and suffering. But nonetheless, it was a rational emotion to have in a world in which one couldn't dial 911 to bring Leviathan in to settle your scores for you, and in which a reputation for toughness and a guarantee of retaliation was your only defense against people who would profit at your expense. And a less obvious one is our desire for attractive mates. Now, the humorist Fran Lebowitz once made a very insightful observation. She said, people who marry someone that they're attracted to are making a terrible mistake. You should marry your best friend. You like your best friend more than you're likely to like anyone that you happen to be physically attracted to. You wouldn't pick your best friend because they have a cute nose, but that's all you do when you marry someone that you're attracted to. You say, I'm going to spend the rest of my life with you because of your lower lip. Now, this is a real puzzle, but it's a puzzle that's solved by the research showing that the physical signs of beauty correlate with fertility, health, and fitness, and therefore, by being attracted to someone who has these physical characteristics, you're maximizing the chance of having healthy children. Now, neuroscience has also undermined the blank slate by showing that there's a complex genetic patterning to the brain. This is a diagram of the visual system of in the primate brain, comprised of some 50 areas interconnected in precise ways that get formed during prenatal development. And that's just one sense in the entire brain. Not just the overall cabling diagram of the brain, but some of its fine structure also seems to be under genetic control. Here are the results of a study by the neurobiologist Paul Thompson and his colleagues, in which they looked at pairs of people and measured the degree of correlation in the amount of gray matter in different parts of the brain. And they plotted them in false color so that purple corresponds to no correlation, and any color other than purple shows that if one person has more gray matter in a certain part of the brain, the other one does as well. Now, if you pair people at random, you get a uniformly purple brain by definition, because randomly selected people can't be correlated. This is a left view, right view, top view. Here's what happens when you start to compare people who share 50% of their genes, namely fraternal twins. And as you can see, variations in amount of gray matter are far more similar in fraternal twins than in strangers, and they are more similar still in identical twins who share 100% of their genes. All of the areas that deviate from purple here are parts of the brain whose gray matter volume is affected by the genetic similarity. Now, these differences are not just differences in anatomy, like the shape of your earlobes, but they have functional consequences, which are nicely summed up in the following famous New Yorker cartoon by Charles Addams. Separated at birth, the Malifert twins meet accidentally. Now, the cartoon is only somewhat of an exaggeration, because studies of real-life twins who are separated at birth show that they have astonishing similarities. My favorite example being the pair of twins, one of whom was brought up as a Catholic in a Nazi family in Germany. The other was brought up as a Jew in a family in Trinidad. When they were reunited in their 40s, both showed up wearing identical shirts. Both of them kept rubber bands around their wrists. Both of them liked to dip buttered toast in coffee. Both of them flushed the toilet both before and after using it. And both of them liked to sneeze in crowded elevators to watch people jump. Now, these are anecdotes, but they are all corroborated by quantitative measures of personality and intelligence in twins separated at birth. And they and other results lead to the first law of behavioral genetics, which is that all behavioral traits are partially, although nowhere near completely, heritable. Now, the noble savage has also come under threat from the sciences of mind. Behavioral genetics has shown that among the traits that are partly genetically influenced are some of our nastier characteristics, such as antagonism, unconscientiousness, tendency to violent crime, and psychopathy. Neuroscience has identified brain mechanisms that are associated with aggression. Evolutionary psychology and anthropology have shown the ubiquity of conflict in human social life and human mental life, for that matter. Now, here's a plot of the percentage of male deaths due to warfare in a variety of societies. That is, if you're a man, how likely is it that you're going to die at the hands of some other man as opposed to all the other things you could die of? The red bars represent various pre-state societies, hunter-gatherer or hunter-horticultural societies in the Amazon rainforest and the New Guinea highlands, and they range from a low of about 10% to a high of almost 60%. The tiny little blue bar at the bottom represents the corresponding statistic for the United States and Europe in the 20th century, and it includes the statistics of 2 world wars. So, not to put too fine a point on it, but when it comes to violence in a state of nature, Hobbes was right, Rousseau was wrong. Now, what about our society, where we enjoy these tiny death rates compared to people in a more natural state? Well, here's a question that a number of psychologists have posed to their subjects, and I'll pose it to you. And please don't answer aloud. Have you ever fantasized about killing someone you don't like? Okay. Well, if you ask that question to a large sample of people, you find that about 15% of women and about a third of men frequently think about killing people they don't like. And about 60% of women and almost 80% of men at least occasionally think about killing people they don't like. And the first time I gave this talk, someone said, yeah, and the rest of them are lying. The ghost in the machine has also come under threat. Cognitive science has shown that intelligence, far from needing some ethereal, mysterious substance, can be explained in mechanistic terms. That someone's beliefs can be considered a kind of information. Thinking can be conceived of as a kind of computation, not the kind that your PC does, but a kind of fuzzy, parallel, analog computation. And that emotions can be understood as mechanisms of feedback and control. Likewise, the sister field of artificial intelligence has shown that human creations, robots and computers, can attain feats that were formerly thought to be accomplishable by mental stuff alone. The most dramatic example being the defeat of the world chess champion Garry Kasparov by the computer program known as Deep Blue. Neuroscience has undermined the ghost in the machine through what Francis Crick has called the astonishing hypothesis, the idea that all of our feelings, perceptions, moods, joys, aches, thoughts, and so on are caused by the physiological activity of the tissues of the brain. And there's much evidence that the astonishing hypothesis is correct. We know, for example, that all forms of thinking give off electrical signals and moreover can be caused by an electrical current. If you send an electrical current into someone's brain, they will have a vivid, lifelike experience. Likewise, mood and perception can obviously be directly affected by chemistry when people take drugs. When a surgeon severs the corpus callosum joining the two cerebral hemispheres, then there are quite literally two consciousnesses coexisting inside a single skull, as if the surgeon bisected the soul with a knife. We know that damage to the brain from strokes or disease can destroy a part of the person. That the brain has a staggering complexity, 100 billion neurons interconnected by 100 trillion connections, which is fully commensurate with the complexity of human thought and behavior. And also, there's reason to believe that when the brain dies, the person goes out of existence. Despite intensive efforts in the 19th century by many reputable scientists, no one has figured out a way to communicate with the souls of the dead. Now, this is not a new idea. It was captured in the Brothers Karamazov, in which Dmitry Karamazov has just been visited by a local academic, and he's now recounting to his brother, who's visiting him, what he's just learned. He says, imagine, inside, in the nerves, in the head, there are sort of little tails. I look at something with my eyes, and when they begin quivering, those little tails, an image appears. That is an object or an action, damn it. That's why I see and then think, because of those tails, not because I've got a soul and that I am some sort of image and likeness. Rakuten explained it all to me yesterday, brother, and it simply bowled me over. It's magnificent, Alyosha, this science. A new man's arising. That I understand, and yet I am sorry to lose God. Well, many people are sorry to lose God or to lose the values that are often associated with God, both from the left and from the right. The academic left has expressed this fear and loathing, an example being the manifesto called Against Sociobiology, composed by Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin, in which they wrote, the reason for the survival of these recurrent determinist theories is that they consistently tend to provide a genetic justification of the status quo and of existing privileges for certain groups according to class, race, or sex. These theories provided an important basis for the enactment of sterilization laws and also for the eugenics policies which led to the establishment of gas chambers in Nazi Germany. And when E.O. Wilson, the author of the book called Sociobiology, lectured at college campuses, throughout the 70s and 80s, he met with picketers and posters such as this one. Come and hear Edward O. Wilson, sociobiologist and the prophet of right-wing patriarchy, bring noisemakers. But it's also the religious and cultural right in this country that's been alarmed. In the Weekly Standard, for example, Andrew Ferguson wrote that biological theories of the mind are sure to give you the creeps, because whether a behavior is moral, whether it signifies virtue, is a judgment that the new science and materialism in general cannot make. He contrasted it with the Judeo-Christian view, according to which human beings are persons from the start, endowed with a soul, created by God and infinitely precious. And this is the common understanding the new science means to undo. Another example of this is that Tom DeLay's theory of the cause of the horrible Columbine high school shootings, in which he said that those crimes are inevitable as long as our school systems teach children that they are nothing but glorified apes evolutionized out of some primordial soup of mud. And according to testimony from a creationist institute in front of the U.S. House Judiciary Committee, Darwinism is undermining the morals of the nation, and in support of that, they cited the following lyrics of a rock song: "You and me, baby, ain't nothing but mammals, so let's do it like they do it on the Discovery Channel." Well, how can we address this fear and loathing, given that I think the sciences of mind and brain are going to increasingly show that there is a human nature that can be rooted in the brain and that is a product of evolution? How can we address these fears? I'm going to, in the rest of the talk, suggest that there are four distinct fears of human nature: the fear of inequality, of imperfectibility, of determinism, and of nihilism, that all are based on non sequiturs. None of them, in fact, really follows from discoveries about what makes us tick, but rather are just signs of the novelty of these ideas. And I'm going to go further and show that not only are discoveries about human nature not as dangerous as people think, but rather denying human nature can be more dangerous than people think. And therefore, this makes it imperative, I think, to study human nature objectively without putting a moral thumb on either side of the scale. Let me start with the fear of inequality, which comes from a simple mathematical fact: 0 equals 0. If we're blank slates, we must be equal, but if the mind has any innate organization, then different races, sexes, or individuals could be biologically different. That would condone discrimination and oppression. Now, I think as soon as you see it stated this baldly, you see that it's based on a false premise, that fairness implies sameness, whereas in fact it doesn't. When the authors of the Declaration of Independence said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," they were not saying, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are clones." Again, fairness is not the same as sameness. Rather, our commitment to political equality is a commitment to recognize certain universal human interests, a part of human nature. As it was written, they are endowed with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Moreover, it's a policy to prohibit discrimination against individuals based on the statistics of certain groups that they belong to, such as their race, ethnicity, and sex, group statistics that we deem morally out of bounds when making important decisions about an individual. Now also, there's, turning now to the downside, it's not the case that thinking that people are blank slates has nothing but good moral consequences. Indeed, many of the examples of ethnic persecution in the 20th century did not come from assuming that people were biologically different, but assuming that they were all the same. And we see this, that is, if you mistakenly assume that all people are identical in their talents and personality, but some of them end up better than others, the natural conclusion is that they must have been more greedy or avaricious. And we see this especially in cases of persecution of ethnic minorities that set up the conditions in which their more talented and ambitious members could prosper. And indeed, many of the atrocities and ethnic persecution of the 20th century consisted of persecution of groups that had visibly talented members, such as the Indians in East Africa and the South Pacific, the Chinese in Malaysia and Indonesia, the Igbos in Nigeria, and the Jews almost everywhere. Now, the second fear is the fear of imperfectibility. And it's a fear of losing the age-old dream of the perfectibility of mankind. And here's how it runs. If unpleasant traits are innate, such as selfishness, violence, prejudice, or rape, that would make them unchangeable, so attempts at social reform and human improvement would be a waste of time. Why try to make the world a better place if people are rotten to the core and will just screw it up no matter what you do? Well, I think this too is a non sequitur, because even if people did have ignoble motives, they aren't automatically translated into ignoble behavior, because the human mind is a complex system with many parts, and some parts can counteract others, such as a moral sense, an ability to learn the lessons of history, and the executive systems of the frontal lobes that I referred to earlier, which can inhibit behavior. Social progress undeniably has taken place, not because human nature has been rewritten, but because some parts of it have been expanded in their application. The philosopher Peter Singer wrote a book called The Expanding Circle, which alludes to the idea that while all people have a moral sense, an ability to sympathize with others, the default setting may be to apply it only to the members of your own clan or village or tribe. But that over the centuries, that notion of treating other people as equally valuable to yourself has been expanded to the nation, to non-white races, to women, to children, to the handicapped, and most recently, we're trying to expand it to embrace all of humanity. Moreover, it's not just that acknowledging human nature condemns us to not addressing the problems that we face, but that a belief in perfectibility has its own downside. And I'll talk about three. The most obvious is authoritarian social engineering. If people are blank slates, well, then we damn well better control what gets written on those slates. The alternative is leaving it to chance. And indeed, many of the worst totalitarians of the 20th century firmly believed in the blank slate. For example, Mao, who's thought to be responsible for some 35 million deaths, wrote, "It is on a blank page that the most beautiful poems are written." The Khmer Rouge, which massacred a quarter of their countrymen, had a slogan, "Only the newborn baby is spotless." And here's another much more benign example, but perhaps part of the same general mindset. Le Corbusier wrote that city planners should begin with a clean tablecloth. We must build places where mankind will be reborn. And here's an example of what he had in mind. This is a diagram by Le Corbusier of Paris, central Paris, or at least what Paris would have looked like if he had been given his clean tablecloth and designed it as a place where mankind could be reborn. Well, he didn't get his wish, but this what now seems to be a ridiculous idea came from an ideology that sometimes called authoritarian high modernism, that cities should be planned according to, quote, scientific principles based on scientific conceptions of human needs. Unfortunately, the scientific conception of human needs was the blank slate, according to which every individual was thought of as needing so many cubic feet of air per minute, so many gallons of water to bathe, so many gallons of water to drink, so many square feet to sleep in, and so on. End of story. Therefore, you could design cities that would satisfy those needs and get rid of the chaos and jumble and noise that offended Le Corbusier so much. Of course, what he left out was the rest of human nature, such as the need for comfortable places where you could engage in intimate social interaction, green space and living things, natural light, which obviously affects people's mood, ornamentation and aesthetics in architecture, human scale and the need to feel like one's in a safe environment, and so on. And though Le Corbusier was not granted his wish to flatten Paris and start all over again, his disciples were given carte blanche to design Brasilia, which is notorious as an uninviting wasteland, and of course the urban renewal projects of the late 50s and early 60s, in which vibrant neighborhoods were flattened and replaced by freeways and concrete high-rises. Finally, second out of three, a downside of perfectibility is a lack of appreciation for democracy. that in the 20th century we saw many atrocities that came about from idealistic, charismatic, revolutionary leaders who claimed to be more morally enlightened than the predecessors they overthrew, and an idea that the state would wither away after a temporary period of authoritarian control, and that we would live in a state of romantic anarchism. Well, I think the results of that are all too horrific. In contrast, democracy is based on a rather jaundiced view of human nature, in which you need permanent checks and balances as a mechanism to counteract human ambition and self-deception. This idea is beautifully captured in an aphorism from James Madison. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary, hence the checks and balances of a modern democracy. The final downside is, I think, a distortion of human relationships, especially parenting. Now, here's a quote from a frazzled mother, quoted in an article in the Boston Globe about parenting, the parenting industry. She said, "I'm overwhelmed with parenting advice. I'm supposed to do lots of physical activity with my kids so I can instill in them a physical fitness habit so they'll grow up to be healthy adults. And I'm supposed to do all kinds of intellectual play so they'll grow up smart. And there are all kinds of play: clay for finger dexterity, word games for reading success, large motor play, small motor play. I feel like I could devote my life to figuring out what to play with my kids. On top of that, I have to be a short order cook preparing 2 or 3 meals at a time, because if I force my kids to choose between eating what's there or skipping a meal, they'll get an eating disorder." Well, I think anyone who's recently been a parent can sympathize with this woman's plight. Now, here are some sobering facts about what we do know about the effects of parenting. Most studies of parenting on which this advice is based are useless because they don't control for heritability. They demonstrate that parents who talk to their kids a lot have kids with better language skills, that parents who try to engage in conversations with their teenagers have teenagers who get into trouble less often, parents who spank their kids have kids who grow up to be violent in their turn, and so on. Not even testing for the possibility that people who are articulate will tend to have kids who are articulate, that people who are violent and are more tempted to spank their children will have kids who grow up to be violent, and so on. When you do control for genetic inheritance, say by retesting these correlations with adopted children, the results are rather sobering. The genetically controlled studies find that siblings who are separated at birth end up as similar as siblings reared together. Now, remember the Malafert twins. Separated at birth, they end up in the patent office with identical contraptions on their laps. That's one finding. I'm referring now to a different finding, which is if the Malafert twins had been brought up together, so they shared their genes and their parental environment, they would have been no more similar than they are if they were reared apart. And a complementary finding is that adopted siblings who share none of their genes but share the same parental environment end up as adults not similar at all. What this suggests is that children are not shaped by their parents, but rather in part by genes, although only in part by culture, both the surrounding culture and the child's own culture, which we call their peer group, and in part by chance, how the brain is wired together in the womb and develops in the first couple of years of life. Now, when people hear of these results, which I should add, are due to a research summary by Judith Rich Harris in her book, The Nurture Assumption, the common reaction is, "Oh, so you're saying it doesn't matter how I treat my children?" Now, this, when you think about it, is an odd response, even though it is a common response. For one thing, well, of course it matters. For one thing, it's never all right to abuse or neglect or belittle a child, because that's just a terrible thing for a big, strong person to do to a small, helpless one who is in their care. Child rearing is, first and foremost, a moral responsibility. But it's also misguided for another reason. Let's say I told you that you can't shape the personality of your spouse. Now, no one but a newlywed seriously believes that you can shape the personality of your spouse. But nonetheless, you probably wouldn't say, oh, so you're saying it doesn't matter how I treat my spouse? Well, of course it matters, because it matters to the quality of the relationship. And similarly, parents and children have a human relationship, and how well they get along, and how well the children will remember how they were brought up, and therefore the feelings that they'll have towards their parents obviously is affected by how the parents treated them. And I think it's a sign of how pervasive the blank slate is that we've forgotten that parenting is a human relationship. Think of it only in terms of the micromanaging or molding of personality, so that when we find that we can't mold the personality of our children, people are tempted to say, well, it doesn't matter how you treat them at all. Let me go over the final two fears in the remaining few minutes. The fear of determinism runs as follows. If behavior is caused by a person's biology, he can't be held responsible for it. And this isn't a totally groundless fear. Here's a headline that I clipped out of the Wall Street Journal a few years ago. Man's genes made him kill, his lawyers claim. And you can insert your favorite lawyer joke here. The defense was not successful. The man did not get off the hook by blaming his genes. And I think when you think about it, it's clear why. Namely, it's captured in the old saying, to understand is not to forgive. Standards of responsibility, holding people responsible, punishing them, rewarding them, criticizing them, praising them, are themselves causes of behavior. These standards don't have to appeal to a ghost in the machine, but rather to certain parts of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, that are capable of inhibiting behavior depending on its consequences. We can retain this influence on the brain systems of inhibition even as we come to understand the brain systems for temptation, and that's why we should continue to hold people responsible. Also, when you go back over the cases, the bogus defenses for bad behavior are more likely to be environmental than biological anyway, such as the abuse excuse that the Menendez brothers used to try to get off the hook for murdering their parents, the black rage syndrome, which the radical lawyer William Kunstler proposed to defend the Long Island Railroad gunman a few years ago, the patriarchy made me do it defense, which some lawyers have tried to use to get rapists off the hook, that they were inflamed by a patriarchal culture and pornographic images. And of course, the most famous one of all, from West Side Story, when the juvenile delinquents explained to the local police officer, "Dear kindly Sergeant Krupke, you gotta understand, it's just our bringing up key that gets us out of hand. Our mothers all are junkies, our fathers all are drunks. Golly, Moses, naturally we're punks." Finally, there's the fear of nihilism, that biology strips life of meaning and purpose. It says that love, beauty, and morality are just figments of a brain pursuing selfish evolutionary strategies. This is captured in a comic strip that I clipped out of the Boston Globe a couple of months ago, which our hero, Arlo, can't sleep, pacing the floors, racked by doubts. He says to his son, "Why am I here?" And the boy answers, "To pass on your genes." You still here? Admittedly, many people don't find this a satisfying answer to the question. Now, some people think that this must be a religious sensibility that has this, but in fact, they're both religious and secular versions of this fear. The religious version, to put it concretely, is that people need to believe in an immortal soul which seeks to fulfill God's purpose and is rewarded or punished in an afterlife. Now, I want to make it clear that in addressing this fear, I don't mean to criticize or undermine religion in general, that there are many biological scientists who believe that there's nothing incompatible between a belief in God and an understanding of brain function and Darwinian natural selection, and I have no argument against that. I'm actually making a defensive argument that often leveled against science, that science must be inherently amoral and that only religion can provide a basis for ethics and morality, thanks to its belief in the afterlife. And that's the belief that I'm going to criticize. A response to this fear is, first of all, that a belief in a life to come devalues life on Earth. Think about what you do with your life when you remind yourself that life is short. You end a silly dispute. You extend a gesture of affection that you might not have done. You vow not to squander time. You vow to spend time with the people you love the most. And in fact, I would argue that it's a recognition that every moment of consciousness is a precious gift that gives life its true meaning. And also, even more sinisterly, God's purpose in practice tends to be conveyed by human beings, and that opens the door to considerable mischief. Now I'm going to show a headline that came out about a year ago from the satirical newspaper The Onion, which many of you may have seen or at least read about. The headline is, "Hijackers surprised to find themselves in hell. We expected eternal paradise for this, say suicide bombers." Now it is a bit tasteless, but I think it conveys an important point, which is that yes, if someone didn't believe in an afterlife, then perhaps they would not be deterred from committing acts of evil by the fear of spending eternity in hell. But on the other hand, they wouldn't be attracted to committing acts of evil by the false promise of spending eternity in heaven. Now, I mentioned that this is not just a religious fear, but it is prevalent among secular thinkers as well. And I'll give as an example of this the opening scene of Annie Hall, in which the young Woody Allen character, he's 7 years old, is taken to the family doctor by his mother. The doctor says, "Why are you depressed, Alvy?" Mother answers for him, "It's something he read." "Something he read, huh?" "The universe is expanding." "The universe is expanding?" "Well, the universe is everything, and if it's expanding, someday it will break apart, and that would be the end of everything." His mother says, "What is that your business?" He stopped doing his homework. And Alvy says, "What's the point?" Well, we laugh because we know that Alvy is a little bit confused here, and I think the ultimate refutation for this, as with many other delusions of childhood, came from his mother, who said, "What has the universe got to do with it? You're here in Brooklyn. Brooklyn is not expanding." And indeed, I think that Alvy's mother has nicely captured the best response to this secular fear of nihilism, that Alvy has confused two different levels of analysis. The human level, what is meaningful to us and how we want to live our lives today, given the brains we have, and the causal level, namely how and why our brains cause us to have those thoughts to begin with. And those should not be confused. That just because evolution is an amoral, purposeless process in which selfish genes try to maximize copies of themselves, that doesn't mean that people are selfish and amoral and purposeless, just that the process that gave rise to people has those characteristics. My final point is that even if you think that a moral sense is a product of evolution and part of the functioning of the brain, it doesn't mean that morality is a kind of hallucination or figment or fiction, because morality has an inherent logic that the human moral sense can be thought of as implementing. And again, I'm going to turn to the comic pages to illustrate this point. From the late lamented comic strip Calvin and Hobbes, in which one day Calvin says to his tiger companion that he, in fact, is going to be a nihilist. He says, "I don't believe in ethics anymore. As far as I'm concerned, the ends justify the means. Get what you can while the getting's good. That's what I say. Might makes right. The winners write the history books. It's a dog-eat-dog world, so I'll do whatever I have to and let others argue about whether it's right or not." "Hey, why'd you do that?" "You were in my way, now you're not. The ends justify the means." "Not, I didn't mean for everyone, you dolt, just me." Well, I think this illustrates the problem with being an amoral egoist, namely that you can't logically insist that other people adhere to a code of behavior that you're not willing to adhere to yourself. And this notion of reciprocity or the golden rule is the core of morality and has been rediscovered by the world's great moral traditions. So let me sum up. I've argued that the dominant theory of human nature in modern intellectual life is composed of the doctrines of the blank slate, the noble savage, and the ghost in the machine. That this theory is being challenged by the modern sciences of mind, brain, genes, and evolution. The challenges are also seen to threaten our moral values, but in fact, that does not follow. On the contrary, I think a better understanding of what makes us tick can clarify those values by showing that political equality does not require sameness, but rather policies that treat people as individuals with rights. That moral progress does not require that the mind is free of selfish motives, only that it has other motives to counteract them. That responsibility does not require that behavior is uncaused, only that it responds to contingencies of credit and blame. And that meaning in life does not require that the process that shaped the brain have a purpose, only that the brain itself have a purpose. Moreover, grounding our values in a blank slate is a mistake, because it makes our values hostages to fortune, implying that someday there are scientific discoveries that could make them obsolete. And it conceals the downsides of denying human nature, including persecution of the successful, totalitarian social engineering, an exaggeration of the effects of the environment, such as in parenting and the criminal justice system, a mystification of the basis of responsibility, democracy, and morality, and the devaluing of human life on Earth. And with that, I'll end and take your questions. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes?
Do you accept Herrnstein and Murray's argument in the bell curve, and do you accept Jared Diamond's thesis in Guns, Germs, and Steel?
Yes, the question is, do I accept Herrnstein and Murray's arguments in the bell curve and Jared Diamond's arguments in Guns, Germs, and Steel? Well, Herrnstein and Murray made many arguments. One that I think has a great deal of data on their side is that within a particular group, part of the variation in intelligence is heritable, that is due to differences in the genes, and moreover that those differences have consequences, statistically speaking, for things like income, social status, and crime. Where they themselves admit that they were on shakier ground, and which I think they are on shakier ground, is saying that differences between groups, in particular differences between African Americans and whites in test scores, such as IQ tests, have both a genetic basis and an environmental basis. I don't think that they've established their case for a genetic basis, largely because we've seen similar group differences in IQ test results earlier in the century, which eventually petered out to nothing. And for all we know, that could also happen to the black-white IQ score gap. But even though it's very difficult using techniques of behavioral genetics to explain group differences, within a group, I think the evidence is overwhelming that Herrnstein and Murray were correct in saying that much of the variation is heritable. Jared Diamond argued that the differences in fortunes among human societies, why the Europeans developed technology and science and the military power that went along with them that allowed them to take over the rest of the world, rather than, say, the Native Americans or the Australian Aborigines or sub-Saharan Africans, can be explained by differences in ecology and geography. More or less that the Europeans were lucky enough to find themselves in a place, this is say 10,000 years ago, with lots of domesticable animals that provided the basis for agriculture and civilization, and moreover they lived in a huge continent that served as a catchment area for innovations across thousands of miles that could be packaged together into a kind of superculture that combined the best of many different peoples, whereas Australia, Africa, and the Americas, because they run north-south, imposed barriers to movement that meant that you couldn't pool discoveries made by different peoples. And I think that's a very convincing argument, and it was also made independently by the economist Thomas Sowell, and I discuss both of them in the book, and I think they've made the case that there's no need to invoke race to explain the differences in fortune between different continent-wide human groups. Yes?
How would you place Freud, who was somewhat absent from the discussion today in your argument?
Yes. Freud obviously had a rather complex theory of human nature. He certainly did not believe in a blank slate, nor did he believe in a noble savage. He believed in a complex mind, as I've argued for, with a number of parts, that among those parts are inclinations that are antisocial, and among those parts are a system that can respond to contingencies of blame and consequences, and therefore inhibit some of these antisocial tendencies. So all of that is compatible, I think, with the view of human nature that I've been arguing for. The difference is that Freud thought that the moral sense and the inhibition of behavior came from internalizing one's parents, that the superego, in a sense, and the conscience largely comes from internalizing the voice of your parents, and moreover, that personality in general was shaped by events in the first 6 years of life. I think both of those doctrines are quite dubious, and there's a lot of evidence against them, some of which I mentioned, such as that children with the same kinds of parents, namely siblings, don't end up any more similar than kids who were brought up in completely different homes. That a lot of the variation that Freud talked about in mental health, in happiness, in mental illnesses such as schizophrenia are now, I think, known with a pretty high degree of confidence to be partly genetic, partly something else, but not parental treatment in the first 6 years of life. Yes?
You never really mentioned anything about life-altering drugs, how they fit into this whole picture. I mean, if we had a lithium-based society, man, we'd be much more peaceful.
Yes, that is, if we had a lithium-based society, we'd be much more peaceful. The problem is that there's I mean, the reason that if we found an anti-violence drug, would you want to, put it in the drinking water? Well, probably not, for a number of reasons. One of them is civil liberties concerns, that I think we don't want the government injecting chemicals into us, that at least that alter behavior. I have no problem with fluoride, which some people do. But also, this is going to sound a little crass, but there's kind of an optimal level of violence. Todd Beamer and the passengers on that flight, if they had been sedated by the drinking water, then we might have had a plane crashing into the White House. So you don't want to get rid of all aggressive impulses. You just want a society in which they're only deployed where they should be, and not where they aren't. I mean, that's sort of a glib answer to your question. Yes?
Yes. Yes, a little bit aside from what you've been discussing, could you possibly answer a question about the nature of mind? And that is the quality, the self-reflective sense of I, the homunculus, if you will. From where do you believe this is generated, for what purpose, and ultimately to what end?
Well, the self-concept, the fact that we can reflect on ourselves, partly I think it's a complex answer. Where does it come from? It probably involves a number of brain areas, of which prefrontal cortex is the one most often alluded to. It partly is there to maintain a certain self-image. That is, I have to know how I'm going to be perceived if I want to win friends and influence people and attract mates and so on. So I've got to have some kind of model of myself. Partly to learn from our mistakes, so that if I think back of what I've done, I could avoid my mistakes and make wiser decisions in the future. We have reason to believe that this isn't just some ghost hovering above the brain, because we know that first of all, that the brain process comes before the subjective experience of making a decision. In a number of famous experiments, it was shown that first the brain has a little electrical activity that corresponds to making a spontaneous decision, and then we feel like we've made the decision. So it's not as if the I causes the brain activity, but rather the other way around. and because we know that the will has a number of quirks. And there's a recent book called The Illusion of Conscious Will by Dan Wegner that assembles a lot of experimental demonstrations that we can actually be fooled as to whether we make a decision or not. So the experience of will and self-reflection, even though it keeps us out of trouble and it keeps us more or less in touch with ourselves, is not an omniscient soul or self, but rather a system with a variety of quirks and prone to error. But it does have these functions. Yes?
How do you explain that the greatest crime of the 20th century was performed by the cream of Western Christian civilization, Germany and Austria, and they were only in power for 10 or 12 years? Had they succeeded, their crimes would have been 10 times greater.
Yes, well, I mean, this is probably the great question of the 20th century, and I can't claim to have any more insight than anyone else. But I mean, I'll mention some partial answers to that question that have been proposed by others that I think are convincing. In terms of the sheer scale of the horror, the fact that we have a technological prowess, that we've got a society that can be organized with hundreds of thousands of people acting in concert and communicating, we've got bureaucracies and railroad lines and so on, mean that some of the evil that may have been confined in past centuries to a few dozen or a few hundred or even a few thousand people could apply in a scale to, in this case, 6 million people. So giving people technological power multiplies the amount of evil they can do if they want to do evil. It's also that the civilization that gave rise to Nazism was quite curious because in one sense it was modern, but in another sense it was quite atavistic. It was celebrated pagan values. It had a very complicated and ambivalent relationship with science. In fact, it was quite hostile to science as we know it, other than application to particular technological projects, and many of the most brilliant scientists had to flee Nazi Germany. It had a romantic love of nature as opposed to, and also was very, pathologically ethnocentric as opposed to being cosmopolitan and open. So it achieved what it achieved through, I think, through this horrific applications of the power of technology. But its ideology, in some sense, may have been modern, but in some sense was also, I think, quite primitive. But again, I can't claim any particular insight compared to the many great minds that have pondered this question. Look on the other side. Yes?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, within the Western tradition of philosophy, there's been a long tradition of the notion of free will, that at any moment we could choose one path or the other. I could have chosen not to ask this question, or otherwise. But it seems to me all the new sciences are pointing to the fact that, if my behavior thoughts are eventually the culmination of lots of complex interactions with neurons, that this notion of free will is probably no longer tenable. What's your take on that?
Well, I think it is. In some sense, it's tenable. And you start to get dizzy when you think about it too deeply. What does "I could have done it differently" mean? If I replayed the tape of the last 10 minutes and played it over again, would I have said the same things? Well, since we can't do that experiment, we don't really know what the answer would be. I think there's several ways in which some notion of free will survives, although probably not the traditional one and not the religious one. One is that there is not, in anyone's wildest dream, anything close to complete predictability of behavior. Perhaps because of stochastic events in the brain, perhaps even due to some kind of quantum events that they get magnified, or due to chaos where a small amount of noise can send the system off in radically different directions. So just purely in grounds of predictability, we're never going to see humans as deterministic in that sense. And we know that people respond to contingencies, to reward and punishment, to examples set by others. And so there's a sense in which people could have done otherwise, meaning that if you place them in one environment where there's a criminal justice system and a police force, and they'll get thrown in jail for looting, versus another environment in which they could loot all they want and nothing will happen, well, they will do differently in one than in the other. Now, that's not free will because it's responding probabilistically to some feature of the environment, but it's what most people want out of free will, namely that you'll make decisions that respond to the consequences of those decisions. And so that's what gets preserved. If the traditional notion just makes the head spin the longer you think about it, that might say more about the way we conceptualize free will than about the brain processes that actually underlie it. Yes?
Yeah, it seems to me that it seems like the ideas of Hobbes and Rousseau all seem kind of post-Renaissance. What kind of theories do you think people have about the human mind during the Dark Ages?
The question is, what theories do people have during the Dark Ages? I think it's a very rich area of study of which I'm sadly too ignorant to try to fake an answer. There was certainly the notion, for example, when I talk about the Judeo-Christian theory, that I certainly was, in a sense, doing violence to the Judeo-Christian theory in that it evolved over many centuries, including what we sometimes call the Dark Ages. And indeed, the doctrine of the separation of the soul and the body is not in the Bible itself, but is one of those doctrines that I think, and if someone really knows this, they should correct me, but I think it emerged in the centuries after the Bible, probably during this period of time called the Dark Ages. That in the Bible there was no clear distinction between mind and body, and so that when there was talk about people being resurrected in a messianic age, it didn't mean that their souls are going to float around, but rather their body was going to come back. But that would be one accomplishment of that period of time, I believe, or at least one development, I should say. Yes?
If you were to reconstruct American society based on your vision of human nature, as opposed to these other visions, I wonder what would be the 2 or 3 most egregious policies that you see that we have now that you would change, because you consider them to be based on a flawed perception of human nature?
Yeah. Well, I make it a point in the book not to make that kind of recommendation, simply because it would be a different kind of I don't try not to make recommendations about policy, except for a couple of narrow exceptions, mainly because I don't think that's what empirical discoveries about mind and brain lead to automatically. What I think science can do is delineate certain social trade-offs that we as a democracy face. For example, if people show some innate differences, you won't have perfect equality of outcome merely by giving people equality of opportunity. Now, does that mean that you should have complete laissez-faire social policy and let people end up as unequal in outcome as their talents and ambitions will take them? Well, not necessarily, and that's a question that, because if you think that equality of outcome is a virtue, then you might sacrifice some freedom in an attempt to achieve that. And in fact, different political positions can be distinguished in terms of what position they take in the trade-off between, say, maximum freedom and complete indifference to inequality, might be, say, an extreme libertarian position, versus maximum equality and indifference to freedom, which would be some kind of totalitarian Marxism, with various left-right positions in between. Now, nothing from the study of heritable talents or personality can dictate what point along that continuum is optimal. It's a question of trading off different moral values, which I don't think scientists, and certainly not me, not I, are in any position to make any better than anyone else. So in a number of cases, I don't make recommendations, but I do suggest here are the trade-offs, which I think is the most that a scientific argument has the right to do. Yes?
In Toffler's theories, which he put forth in his book, Future Shock, he proposed that the accelerating pace much of what he said has become true, but his concept that we could not vary our ability to process this has not been proven one way or the other. What is your stance on that?
Yeah. Well, I think it would depend on, there's a sense in which all of us have gone through what he experiences. I mean, when my, journal subscriptions come in, and every day there are more journals in my field, and I find it harder and harder to keep up, and the emails come in, and I know I should read this interesting article, but how can I find time to do it when I have to do something else? I mean, we all suffer from that anxiety. Whether it's going to lead to a radical change will depend on whether our technology for managing information and our ability to present information in a way that the human mind finds congenial will fall behind how much information there is to process. So, I bought a Palm Pilot a couple of years ago, and that makes things a little easier. I don't have to remember quite as many things. And when I look at data on, say, brain activity, there are now programs that present it as one picture in false color, so I don't have to pour through millions and millions of numbers, and I can take advantage of the pattern recognition abilities of the visual brain. So it's not that all hope is lost, we're just going to get more and more muddled and fall further and further behind. It's going to be, does new information pour in at huge orders of magnitude greater than our new abilities to package it, process it, remember it, and so on. So that's the way I think that'll be addressed. And apparently we have time for one more question. Yes?
I was wondering, it's kind of two parts. Number one, if you agree with what Wilson says about religion, if there's the reason that it wouldn't have developed would be found in evolutionary psychology, that you have kind of a need for not just the moral systems that come with religion, but also sort of the ghost of the machine idea. If you do agree with that, I'm curious to know how easy you think it will be for people to accept your ideas, given that they run contrary.
Yeah. I don't think that, although there's much that with which I'm in sympathy with E.O. Wilson, I don't find his theory of why religious belief is so widespread to be particularly compelling. And my favorite treatment of it is in a book with the modest title Religion Explained by Pascal Boyer of Washington University at St. Louis, which I think has a better explanation. But but regardless of the explanation of why religion is so tempting, does that mean that it always will be, and therefore a more naturalistic understanding of the mind will be forever unattainable? It's not clear, because religions themselves, of course, change. They accommodate to scientific discoveries. The notion of some kind of deity or supreme being gets more abstract. And it's possible that will continue to happen, and so religion will divest itself of the more concrete and archaic beliefs and become more and more abstract. So it's possible that people will become kind of some kind of deist and a form of religion compatible with science will evolve, but I don't know if it will, just that's one of the possibilities. I've been told to bring the evening to a close, and again, I thank you for your attention.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.